Great. And thanks, everyone. I'm the warm-up act for later today. I just wanted to give everyone an update. You will have known, of course, that there had been a planned First Minister's Conference today in Ottawa. We learned yesterday at the airport in Vancouver as we were about to board, thankfully, before we boarded, that Prime Minister Trudeau was in self-isolation, awaiting the results of his spouse, Sophie Trudeau's test for COVID-19. As it turned out, the test came back positive, and I think I speak for all of you here and all British Columbians wishing a speedy recovery and all the best to Sophie and the Trudeau family. So under those circumstances, we put together a quick conference call with the First Ministers today, and I want to just outline for you some of the issues that we discussed and the plans going forward. You will have been aware that last week the federal government announced a $1 billion package as a first step towards addressing the challenges of COVID-19, $500 million of which will be going to the provinces and territories for healthcare supplies and services. We have already made a fairly comprehensive list working with health authorities, with the Public Health Office and others, the list of equipment and supplies that we will need going forward in the event of a surge of cases that we may anticipate in the days and weeks ahead. That's been transmitted to the federal government. Unlike many federal programs, I've had assurances from Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, from the Prime Minister, and again today on the conference call, that those resources will not be allocated on a per capita basis, as they often are, but instead on a needs-based account, as it were. And I'm grateful for that, and I think it's fairly self-evident. British Columbia has been at the front in terms of testing. We have a significant number of cases. Ontario, I believe, now has passed us in terms of cases identified, but keep in mind that they have almost 3 times the population of British Columbia. So when the federal government is dispersing those resources, they're going to be doing it on a needs-based basis, and I'm grateful for that. We also talked significantly and extensively about how we would deal with companies and, most importantly, workers that will be displaced as a result of the almost cross-economy shutdown of activity, whether it be events, whether it be logistics chains, and the impact on employees, the impact on companies is our paramount importance after, of course, taking care of people's safety and their well-being, taking care of public healthcare providers, protecting those healthcare workers to the extent that we can, and broadly supporting our healthcare system. We also need to be mindful of the consequences to our economy. And so the bulk of the conversation, the bulk of the issues that I raised today with the Prime Minister focused on that, and how we wanted to ensure that the employment insurance program was as flexible as it could be to ensure we capture as many employees who are affected as is possible. Oftentimes, you need a certain number of weeks, you need to be in a certain sector. It doesn't take into account contract workers, it doesn't take into account those workers that are potentially self-employed. And so we want to make sure that the federal government expands these programs to the greatest extent possible. And going forward, Minister James will be working in collaboration with Minister Morneau. So as we develop programs to assist those companies that have been adversely affected, and of course those employees, those workers, we're going to be doing that together. And if I could take anything away from the conversation today, although I was looking forward to gathering with the other premiers across the country, despite our geographic differences, despite our political and partisan differences, it's been my experience over the past 2.5 years that we have far more in common as Canadians than we often let out. And there was a unanimity of purpose on the call from the federal government as well as from premiers of every political stripe, that we needed to focus on making sure people got what they needed as quickly as possible. And I think this is an unprecedented period in our history, and this is a challenge that we've seen in our past, but one I think that we're going to take up together, and I'm very excited about that. Some of the concerns that I raised with the federal government. Here in British Columbia, we're still concerned about points of entry. We have to the south of us in Washington State a significant outbreak, and as you know, Minister Dix and Dr. Henry have been telling you on a daily basis that we've seen actually no increase in cases from China, no increase in cases from Iran, but we have seen an increase in cases from the United States, particularly connected to travelers coming into our points of entry. So border crossings, airports, ferry terminals when it comes to Vancouver Island, these are areas where I wanted the federal government to up their game, and I made that pretty clear, and the Prime Minister understands that British Columbia is perhaps in a unique situation. The cancellation until July of the cruise ship industry, I think, is an appropriate first step. But I also reminded the Prime Minister that we have a cruise ship company of our own, BC Ferries, that moves up and down the coast of British Columbia, connecting communities, and has done so for a long, long time. And they do that on an hourly basis. And one of the issues that the federal government put in place just recently is to ensure that all passengers leave the car deck and go on to the main and mezzanine decks for the duration of the trip. The BC Ferries has requested lenience from Transport Canada, and that hasn't been granted. So I raised with the Prime Minister my view that in this instance we want to see social distancing, and if we have to direct people to leave their vehicles to congregate in smaller spaces for an hour and a half, that's not good public health policy, and the Prime Minister assured me that he would discuss that with his colleagues at Transport Canada. In terms of other issues that we discussed, again, there are a whole host of concerns that we have about whether we're putting in place the 14-day self-isolation period for citizens. We should also be ensuring we're doing that for travelers who come to British Columbia and Canada. And I think the federal government's already responded to that in large measure by restricting the number of points of entry in terms of airports that foreign travelers can enter Canada, and that the screening will be more intense at those jurisdictions and those areas than in the past. I did not get a commitment that Vancouver YVR would be one of those, but I expect, based on the volume of traffic through, that will be an obvious choice. But again, I have every confidence that the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the federal government were very receptive to the conversations they were having today with premiers across the country. Provinces deliver health services, and so it was comforting to hear the federal government recognizes and acknowledges that their role is to aid and assist us in the delivery of those services, and I'm grateful for that. I have a number of other issues I'm sure will come out in the form of an answer, somewhat similar to Jeopardy, so I'll leave it to you to ask those questions, and then I'll let you have time to await Adrian and Bonnie Henry.
Let's start with Richard. One question, no follow-ups, just a reminder.
You can do it. You mentioned the economy. What do you say to small businesses in British Columbia, and all businesses of all sizes, who are terrified about what this virus is going to mean for their viability as well as for their employees?
Yeah. Well, I can say to them that both orders of government, federal and provincial, understand the profound impact that the events of the past number of weeks will have on their businesses and on their employees, and we stand ready to work with them in partnership. There was an announcement today of a significant fund for loans. We are working, Carol James is working on a package of stimulus package, not on the infrastructure side. We have, as you know, one of the most aggressive infrastructure plans in the country. Other premiers talked a lot about infrastructure because they're lagging behind perhaps in their joint funding proposals. We have the resources to partner with the federal government, so we're well down the track on infrastructure spending. We wanted to make sure that we had stimulus to protect those small businesses, to protect those employees. And I think people think about the Canucks season being suspended. The consequences to those people who work in concessions, the consequences to those people who derive their income from events, from hospitality, from tourism. Those are areas, Lisa Baer, the Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture, is part of our Cabinet Committee. She raised today concerns in the film sector. We've seen the suspension of some productions here, and that's happening in the United States as well. It's not confined to British Columbia, but you can go sector by sector by sector, and you're seeing disruption. So we're ready to work with the federal government and sector by sector to protect those businesses, and equally important to make sure that their employees do not feel they have to go to work when they shouldn't. And that's the big deal here. We want to make sure that the advice that we've been giving the public through Dr. Henry is followed, and people don't feel there's going to be economic consequences if they don't. And that's a big, big job for governments across diverse sectors, but we're ready to go. And Minister James is already back at it early this week, working with the federal government to put those programs in place.
Lisa.
to figure out what to ask with only one. Talking about your conversation with the Prime Minister about our border to the south. It seems that our border guard's going to say something to people coming up, saying you should quarantine for 14 days. Like, we're hearing the message from our news and our government. Americans don't listen to our news.
Well, the good news is that the United States declared a state of emergency today, well behind the rest of the world, but that's good news that the U.S. federal government is now on board here. And I'm hopeful that that will see a whole bunch of new activity in the United States. I haven't spoken with Governor Inslee this week. I know he is fully occupied with the challenges in Washington State, but we have solid working relationships at the staff and at the political level. We have business connections. Microsoft has significant presence in both Canada, Washington State, and in British Columbia, and that's duplicated in other sectors as well. So we're going to continue to work as closely as we can with our friends and allies in Washington State, and we're hopeful that these border questions, which are federal issues on both sides, federal in Washington, of course, and federal in Ottawa, when it comes to points of entry, international points of entry, that we have got the message across loudly and clearly that we need to have a consistent message for all travelers, regardless of their citizenship.
Will our border guards be saying something?
That's the federal responsibility, and I'm not punting that, Lisa, when I say that. We made it pretty clear. The Prime Minister heard that loudly. British Columbia is in a unique position because of the significance of the outbreak in Washington State, but the Detroit-Windsor crossing, Doug Ford was very much aware of that. Connections to Quebec and the Maritimes from those states, the border states, are significant. Not as significant as we have here, of course, but they are significant. And the federal government gets that, and I think they're going to be upping their game in that area.
Keith?
So the list of equipment you've compiled, I assume we're talking respirators, masks, this type of thing. How much of that are we talking about, and was there any pushback on the needs basis of allocation rather than per capita?
We didn't go through the inventory, Keith. It's a big document, and if I can't make it available to you, I know that Dr. Henry and Minister Dix will. We just passed it on. It was part of the preparations for the First Minister's meeting, so that's now in the hands of the federal government, and it would be, in that sense, a public document. I will say I learned something today that Dr. Tam, the national or the federal health officer, continued to refer to the work that's been done in British Columbia because we were so early to get on this. But she made reference in terms of swabs. BC has developed or used a swab that is in abundance that hasn't been historically used for this purpose, determined that the efficacy was there, or the value of using this swab was as equal or greater than the existing swab. So now we have almost a limitless supply of swabs. So that's diminished our need. And that was highlighted today in the call by Dr. Tam. So I was pleased again at the innovation of BC in addressing this issue, taking outside of the box thinking right off the bat. So that's been able to help other jurisdictions as well.
Mary?
Just two things. Just to clarify, in your discussion today regarding compensation for people who are contract workers, and if they have to stay at home for 2 weeks, could they possibly expect compensation in the days ahead? And just wondering, we've seen all the videos of these people panic buying at the stores, if you could address that.
Well, certainly on the compensation, these are the issues that Minister James and Minister Morneau are working on. There are programs in place through EI. We need to make sure those programs are expanded. The existing programs will not meet the needs of the moment. And if we're asking people, rightly so, to stay away from their workplace for a 2-week period, they need to know that they're doing that without fear of having adverse consequences for their families. And again, all of the premiers were pretty clear on that. The Prime Minister absolutely got it. The challenge now is that these are non-traditional mechanisms that we have to develop to deliver that service. And we stand ready to do that, as does the federal government. Now the test will be how successful will we be. And I keep saying to my spouse, who I talk to about these things, that as much as we're going day to day, we also have a responsibility to look 4, 5, 6 weeks from now, and what will the consequences be? And that's why we have a cross-government approach to this, and that's why I'm looking back now gratefully on the relationships that I've been able to build with Washington State, with the federal government, so that we can get right at it without having to build a relationship first. And so I can say candidly and directly to the Prime Minister, these are our needs. And he doesn't doubt that I'm being genuine. He knows I'm not trying to get advantage. I'm trying to get services and tools so the people of BC can get through this very difficult time that we have ahead of us. And it will be difficult. I don't want anyone to be under any illusion. But we have to make sure that we're doing our level best to protect the public. And in a healthcare emergency, we need to depend on the science. And fortunately, Dr. Henry and her extraordinary staff have been in place working effectively for a number of months on this, and we're in a good spot.
We're going to
and on the one part question, on the bulk buying, it's a mystery to me. I'm profoundly disappointed in people who are hoarding and then selling online. I think that's just offensive, and most people would bristle at that. I joked about a special place for people like that. And I'll leave it at that. But I think people should be measured in their responses, and they should make sure they're prepared. But let's not be ridiculous about this, and let's be thoughtful and reflect on the consequences of us buying everything. What does that mean for the next person in line that desperately needs that product? So let's be reasonable, people.
We're going to take a couple of questions from the phone and before we come back to the room. First, we have Mijan Lee.
Hi, Premier. Just getting back to the 14-day self-isolation for people who have traveled. Is there any way that you can enforce these directives? And if the situation gets worse, are you considering any measures to make this from a recommendation into an order, any measures to make it more compulsory for people to comply?
Well, thank you for that. And my first hope is that people, and it's been my experience so far. As I said, I was in an airport yesterday. It was an almost empty airport, but people were coming up to me and we were having conversations, and people talk to me as I move around British Columbia and around in my own community. And there is a sense of let's do the right thing, not just for ourselves, but for our community and our province and our country. And I think that that the 14 days should be something that the public understands and recognizes. If they're going to be on non-discretionary travel, they should recognize that that includes protecting their families, their neighbors, and their community. Having said that, Dr. Henry has the authority to act if required, but at this point, our objective is to direct people that this is the best course of action for themselves, and for the community, and we're hopeful that people will comply.
Next, we have Justine Hunter.
Hi, Premier. I know it's early to say what the economic impact will be on the province this year, but your government has been keen on delivering balanced budgets. I'm just wondering today how important that is.
Well, we have tabled a budget and a 3-year fiscal plan. That was prior to massive drops in the stock markets. That was prior to massive drops in expectations for growth rates, not just in BC, but internationally. And so we'll be monitoring, and you know Minister James to be prudent, and she will be monitoring daily revenues in and expectations out. But I did not seek election, and I did not want to form a government just to balance the budget. It was to deliver services for people. And I said during the election campaign when those questions came, Justine, that our objective was to make sure that people had what they needed to prosper and thrive in British Columbia, and that remains unchanged. We have a balanced budget this year, next year, and the year after, but that is definitely at risk. I'm not misleading anyone by saying that. The activity on the stock market alone has had a profound impact on a whole host of sectors, and that will have an impact on revenues going forward. And so as we look at where we can find relief for people, whether it be on property taxes for small businesses or a host of other initiatives that we can look at to stimulate or at least take the pressure off. If that means that the budget will be changed, then we'll do that. But at this point, we're going day by day, and it would be, I think, at this stage where we're still in fiscal year 2019-2020, to talk about 2020-21 before we're even through the fiscal year we're living in, I think is premature.
Next, we're going to Mary Brooke.
Hi, Premier. The federal government's $10 billion credit support to businesses is being directed, as you know, through the Business Development Bank and Export Development Canada. So how will BC help small businesses get direct assistance, not just property tax later on?
Well, we're looking at that right now, Mary. Minister James and Minister Morneau will be speaking later today. There's regular conversations now, again, not just at the finance level, but Minister Farnworth is talking with respect to emergency preparedness with his federal counterpart, Minister Blair, as well as partners across the country. So we're looking at best practices. How can we all look inside our toolbox and also outside our toolboxes within our jurisdictions and across jurisdictions to make sure we're doing everything we can. But it is uncharted territory. But what I can say is that the sense I got today from listening and talking with my counterparts across the country is everybody understands the challenge ahead and they're doing their level best to be up for it.
We're going to Scott Roberts next.
Hi, Premier. We just want to ask about the standalone clinics. A lot of standalone clinics that we've seen in other provinces popping up. I mean, they're commandeering hockey arenas, those sorts of things, to get people tested who have these symptoms. When are we going to see more of these in Metro Vancouver and other areas of the province so people can actually get the test that they need?
Well, I'm sorry to skirt that one, Scott, but I think that's a better question for Dr. Henry and Minister Dix. But I will say that you can't get tested unless you're referred, and you don't need a test unless you have symptoms. And I think it's really important that all of a sudden there's this sense, and the United States is trying to catch up. There was a point a few weeks ago where there had been more tests in British Columbia than there had been in the entire United States. And based on tests per million people, British Columbia is third in the world behind Korea, Iceland, and then British Columbia. So we have made available testing facilities, and those who require tests are getting them. But again, I'll defer the when will there be more and how will they be deployed to Dr. Henry. I know that's part of their plan.
And we're going to finish today back in the room with Tessa's question.
Okay. So I'm wondering for essential travel across the borders with truck drivers coming up and down the United States. How are we going to manage that? What kind of directives are they getting?
Well, the directive is for non-essential travel. Obviously, if it's part of your business, part of your livelihood, that's a different kettle of fish. And again, I would suggest that Dr. Henry would be in a better position to answer that. It's my understanding that the directive is for those who are going on a holiday, those who are going for a shopping trip, those that require back and forth across the border, again, keeping in mind the tremendous amount of trade we have between British Columbia and the entire west coast of North America, not just Washington, but Oregon and California, which is oftentimes truck related, that those businesses need to continue operating so that we have logistics chains open so we get the goods and services that we need here in British Columbia, and also we can get what we deliver to the rest of the world out to the rest of the world. But on any restrictions when it comes to essential travel, I'll leave that to Dr. Henry.
So are truck drivers going to be isolating themselves when they come back?
Again, I think that's a better answer given to you by the Public Health Office, not by me. My understanding is that those processes are in play, and they'll be in a better position to answer it.
We actually have one more, Vaughn.
Pressure's on. You said that the
on me or on you?
provinces presented a list to the federal government of what it's looking for under this $500 million thing. And equipment and supplies, preparing for a surge of cases. How big a surge do we have to prepare for? And the other question would be, out of that is, I assume every government in the world is trying to do this. Did you hear any concerns that there may be medical supplies out there, high-end technical stuff that is actually not available because other governments have already snapped it up?
I haven't heard that, but that makes sense. If you have people running on toilet paper, I suspect if you need ventilators, there'll be a run on ventilators as well. But I do know that we have been preparing for this for some months now, and well, certainly many, many weeks. And those decisions on purchases and procurement were probably being made some time ago. Again, a better answer for Dr. Henry and Minister Dix. But our expectation, the request from the federal government was, what do you need? So we gave them a pretty comprehensive list. And whether we need it now or later, or we got it already and we would like to be reimbursed, those are issues I can't answer, but I'm sure someone can.
How far this thing could go, haven't you?
Yes, I have, but that's not, I didn't hear that as your question. I thought you wanted to know what we were doing about purchases.
How big a surge do we have to prepare for?
Well, that again is a public health question, and it varies. We know that community transmission has not been as great as we had feared, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. The examples in the Washington State are I think, illustrate for us that this can go very, very quickly. And of course, looking at Italy and other jurisdictions around the world, we're fortunate today, but we may not be fortunate tomorrow. And I think most people understand that. And we have to ensure that we're providing information to you and to the public as we receive it. And when I say that we're expecting more, I think we have to plan for that. And we have to find the balance between apathy and alarmism, and we have to find, we need to be focused, but we also need to be factual. And so to suggest that I have a guess at what's coming, I don't. But I do know that the best people that we could have are on this case, and I'm very confident, and the public should have confidence that everything that can be done is being done.